Welcome to Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies. College of Jewish Studies offers university-level learning without quizzes, sororities, or football. And tonight we continue our series on Israel since 1967. Our guest is the journalist Peter Beinart. We're delighted that all of you are here. Just a few announcements, because what would a synagogue be without announcements? So this Shabbat is the second yahrzeit that we celebrate of our dear teacher, Rabbi Harold Schulweis. And we're going to be celebrating and commemorating his yahrzeit with a weekend of learning. Our scholar in residence for this weekend is Rabbi Avi Weiss. Rabbi Weiss is the acknowledged leader of Open Orthodoxy, a revolution within the Orthodox community to open Orthodoxy to new ideas and to new practices, including the ordination of women Orthodox rabbis. And this great rabbi will be our teacher for the entire weekend. There's a Friday night dinner, costs a few dollars, but I got to buy the chicken. And then afterwards, he's going to speak. If you want to eat dinner at home, come for dessert. So dinner starts at 6. Rabbi Weiss will start around 7. Come and have dessert on us. And join us Friday night to learn with this great rabbi. On Shabbos morning, he'll be teaching Torah study at 9 o'clock, speaking from the beam at 11:30, and then having a dialogue with me at 12:30. And then that evening at 6:30 on Saturday night, we'll have a little Saturday night Malava Malka. We'll do Havdalah, we'll sing a little bit, we'll eat a little bit, and we'll talk again about the future of the Jewish world. He's a wonderful teacher. I hope you'll come and join us. And then we're going to be on hiatus. We're going to go away for the Hanukkah and Christmas holidays. Wish everybody a very happy holiday. And we'll come back in January. And our first session, I think, is January 9th, I think, is the first one. It's the second Wednesday in January. And our guest, once again, will be Yoav Ben Chorin, who's the Director of Global Education at the De Toledo High School. And he's going to be talking to us about Israel and the region and how Israel has grown into a regional power and what that means. This next semester, we'll be welcoming Steve Popper from the Rand Institute to talk to us about the development of Israeli economics. We'll be welcoming some scholars from the community on Israeli culture, and we'll be welcoming Sam Grunsweig, who is the Consul General of the State of Israel, to our conversation. You can't hear? What I just said was so important. I will speak slower and clearer. Tonight is all right, I'll do it. All right. Come Shabbos. That's all you have to hear. Come Shabbos, 9 o'clock. Just come. Spend the whole day. That's all you need to know. I'd like to ask everyone to stand, turn to the folks beside you, and wish them welcome and good evening. This is a shul custom. You'll like this custom. It's nice. We're delighted you're here. Please embrace those beside you and draw them close. It's echoing, right? I'll do the best I can. I'll do the best I can, William. I'll do the best I can. Put your arms about each other and draw each other close. We are the first generation in the history of the Jewish people for 2,500 years to get to struggle with the issues of sovereignty, Jewish power. That's quite a remarkable gift. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. Here's what I'm going to suggest you do. Take the mic off the stand.
Okay, great.
And just hold it, and that way you'll speak right into it, because that's been our problem. Yeah. These are unidirectional mics. So
Okay.
it's a multi-directional congregation. Unidirectional mics. Good evening. I want to welcome you tonight. And I want to introduce you to our guest. Before I introduce the guest to you, Peter, this is one of the very few places among North American Jewry that can talk about Israel from multiple perspectives with a sense of civility, with a sense of understanding, with an ability to listen to one another. That is the greatness of this congregation. Tonight, our guest is Peter Beinart. Mr. Beinart is a professor of journalism at City University of New York. He is a regular editor and columnist of the Atlantic Monthly and a blogger, I guess you'd call it, a columnist for the Haaretz. If you want to read his stuff, do what I do, just subscribe to it, and you can get it without having to wade through all the ads. And it's always wonderful because Mr. Beinart represents a certain voice of the American Jewish left. And that's a very interesting voice. That came from the right side of the room. I wanted to know that. And I'm really delighted that you've come tonight to be with us. I really appreciate your coming. So let me begin with something sort of personal. When it was announced that you were coming, there were members of the congregation that sent me responses. Most of them were polite. And they said something along the following lines. When I read Peter Beinart, especially about Israel, I read a flow of criticism about Israel's policies and practices in government. Rabbi, there's so much that's negative in the press about Israel. And our kids go to college and there's so much negative about Israel on college campuses. Why would you want to bring a person who continues to talk negatively about Israel to our synagogue? Don't we hear enough? And I thought, I answered them, but I really thought that was a rather intelligent question. And I want to ask you that question.
Well, thank you. And, you know, if there's anybody here in the audience who's one of the people who wrote that email, I just want to say that I'm particularly grateful to you for coming, because I think one of the problems we have in the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community is that people generally only go to hear the people they already agree with. And that's certainly as much reality on the left as it is on the right. So if you're the person in the audience who sent that email, feels like they disagree with me the most vehemently of anyone in the room, then Yasher Koach. I mean, you are the person to whom I'm most grateful for coming, because you're really setting an example for all of us in terms of being willing to hear opinions that you disagree with. And I would also say, if it makes you feel better, that you would have the enthusiastic support in your criticisms of me of some of the people in my own extended family. When a couple years ago, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Cape Town. My parents are South African, and I was very excited to do it. But I was warned by the people there that there were some hotheads who were planning a demonstration outside. And I thought, I wonder who these hotheads are. And they said, oh, well, you probably wouldn't know them. And they rattled off their names. They were my cousins. I like Jews who are far to my right politically. I call them my family. In terms of this question, which I think is a good question, about not just criticizing Israel privately, but criticizing Israel publicly, where anyone who wants to can hear, regardless of what their own motivations may be. I would say a couple things. The first thing is, even if I were to devote my entire life to saying nothing but criticism of Israel and the Jewish people, I could never amass as much criticism of Jews as is recorded in a book called Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Our core text is many things, but one of the things it is an extraordinary compendium of Jews behaving badly, right? I mean, just look at this week's Parsha, right? This week's Parsha, we learn, that Jacob, in addition to his sons, also has a daughter. Her name is Dinah. The people of the son of the son of the leader of Shechem wants to marry her. This is a particularly, I think, problematic way to respond to a mixed marriage, right? The response is to say, Sure, that's fine, but everyone in Shechem is going to have to get circumcised. And then when they're recovering from the circumcision, Shimon and Levi, the sons of Yaakov, go in and they kill everybody. And they loot and pillage the place, right? Now, that was not just a story that was written to be consumed by Jews, right? These texts have been read far and wide around the entire world. And in fact, Jews have even been made by anti-Semites to pay for publicly recording our own misdeeds, right? We read on Yom Kippur, for instance, that one of the justifications for the martyrdom of the rabbis was that the Roman emperor said, no one has paid for the sin of the selling of Joseph, right? You, the rabbis of this Mishnaic period, will pay. So I think, but we as a tradition, I think, have generally believed that it was better to be honest with ourselves, to speak openly and honestly about our own failings, even though people who wished us ill could hear us, because what was important ultimately, their opinion was less important than our behavior. That ultimately, the best safeguard for us as a people was not what they thought, but what we did. So I happen to believe that Israel is on a very dangerous path. I could be wrong about that. We can have that discussion. But if I do believe that, then the question is this. Am I being a better friend to Israel if I try to change the course that it's on? And I'm a journalist. I write. That's what I do. Other people have different ways of influencing things, but I'm a journalist. I write. That's what I do. Am I a better friend to Israel if I make those criticisms in the hope that Israel will change course and the American Jewish community will change course? Or am I a better friend if I stay silent? Maybe people won't read my criticisms of Israel, but I will forego any opportunity I have to change Israel's path. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but the reason I believe Israel is on a dangerous path is that I think that part of the miracle of the creation of the State of Israel was not simply that Jews created a Jewish state, but that Jews created a Jewish state along liberal democratic lines. That this was at the heart of the Zionist project. If you read Theodor Herzl's famous novel about where he imagines what a Jewish state would look like, Anstland, right? That novel is not actually about the creation of a Jewish state. It's about the character of the Jewish state, and it's largely about an election in this imagined Jewish state between one party that wants all the people in that state, including Arabs, to have the right to vote, and another party that doesn't. And Herzl has one of the people who believes in democracy say at one moment in this novel, we must believe in liberality, tolerance, and love of mankind. Only then is Zion truly Zion. And Israel, in its founding document, its Declaration of Independence, doesn't have a constitution, but it has a Declaration of Independence, writes that this will be a state that commits itself to freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the Hebrew prophets, and will provide complete equality of social and political rights irrespective of race, religion, and sex. Now, that was not written by a bunch of liberal Jews sitting in some nice cafe, not having to worry about anything in a safe, secure environment. It was written by people who were creating a country in the shadow of the Holocaust that was instantly at war with its neighbors. And they believed that Israel would be more secure, would be a stronger proposition if it were founded as a democracy, and they were incredibly prescient. Because in 1948, the number of democracies in the world was very small. But what we have seen since then is that democracy has become the language, the lingua franca of our times. And that we've found again and again that authoritarian governments that are not based on the consent of the governed are weak, but governments that are based on the consent of the people who live under them actually in the long term are strong. It was extraordinary foresight for the founders of Israel to see that a Jewish state would be stronger, founded on those principles. And that's why, for Israel to control millions of Palestinians in the West Bank who are not citizens of the country in which they live, who live under military law, don't live under the same legal system as the Jews who live alongside them in the West Bank, don't have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. This is a desecration of the principle upon which Israel was founded and a danger to Israel, because ultimately, having millions of people who lack basic rights living in your country is a grave threat to the existence of that country. That's why Ehud Barak recently said, and was quoted in an article in Politico this summer, that if you got the heads of the Israeli military and security establishment together, the IDF and the Mossad and the Shin Bet, that 90% of them, this was his quote, 90% of them would say Israel is safer with a border, with a Palestinian state, than it is holding permanently millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. This is why David Ben-Gurion said that he believed that Israel's control and increasingly permanent enmeshment in the West Bank was a mortal threat to the future of Israel. So that's what I believe. I could be wrong, but given that I believe it, I think I serve Israel better by saying it in the hopes that I can change a few minds rather than staying silent and allowing Israel to do something that I think is dangerous for it and ultimately also dangerous for the Jewish people around the world.
So let me, at the end, when he's finished, we'll clap. Let's not make let's not make him feel too comfortable, you know. Thank you. That was very sweet. Those on the right look upon those on the left with somewhat from suspicion to disdain, and I think I can characterize the reason why. Because they say that the people on the left practice a politics of yes, but. Yes, Palestinian culture is deeply murderous, and yes, Hamas is deeply destructive, and yes, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and every other bad guy in the Muslim world is on Israel's borders, but the reason why there is the situation is because of Israeli policies. The reductive element of leftist politics, which says, irrespective of all those other factors, these complicating factors, it's all Israel's fault. The reviewer in the New York Times of your 2010 book used a phrase which I want to quote because I think it opens up this kind of critique. He said that your book, you dismissed all of the vulnerabilities of Israel, and the phrase he used was that Beinart liberates the book from the practicalities of politics. That it was entirely moral and ethical, and in that sense, beautifully prophetic. But when it comes down to the real politic of making peace, the left doesn't take into consideration the deep complexity and blames it all on Israel. It's a blame Israel first politics. So how would you respond to that?
Right. Well, look, I can't speak for all people on the left. I certainly think it's absurd to blame Israel for the existence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right there. Many causes for the existence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They're not very much about Israel at all. I wouldn't call Palestinian culture murderous. I don't believe in kind of generalizations about an entire culture that way. But there's definitely there are definitely forces within the Palestinian national movement that have done grotesque things and continue to. And I write about that actually, although the reviewer doesn't in the New York Times didn't choose to mention it actually in some detail. The question for me is not, did Israel create these problems? The roots of Palestinian politics lie very deep in a whole set of circumstances. It seems to me the more important question to ask is, how should Israel respond to the Palestinian politics today, right? And I think what you see among Palestinians is a division. And I think it's important how we think about the division among Palestinians. It is not a division between people who like Israel and people who don't like Israel, right? I know a lot of Palestinians. I know a lot of Palestinian activists. I've never met a Palestinian who likes Israel. I've never met a Palestinian who is glad that Israel was created, right? The vast majority of Palestinians believe that Israel's creation was illegitimate, colonial, racist, and every other bad word you can find, right? Their experience with Zionism, as they tell it, is an experience and is an extremely negative experience, right? So I am not here telling you that there are a bunch of Palestinians out there who think Israel is great and want to make peace with Israel because they love Israel so much. I don't know those people. I don't think they're, I mean, you could always find one or two, but in general, that is not the way most Palestinians feel. The important division in Palestinian politics is not about whether to love Israel, it's about what to do about Israel, right? And there is one group of people who say, we are going to fight Israel for as long as it takes until this Jewish cancer in our midst is destroyed, and we will be in control of all of this land, right? No matter how many of our own children die in the process, right? And there's a second group of people who say, you know what? We've been trying some version of that for a while, and it hasn't worked out very well. More of ours get killed than theirs, and we end up with a smaller and smaller amount of territory, right? We rejected a partition plan which would have given us 43% in 1947, and now we're basically can't even get 22%, which is the West Bank and Gaza are 22% of British Mandatory Palestine. So as much as I wish the Zionists had never come from Europe here, they have created a very powerful state. And if we are ever going to have our children not growing up under the occupation of a foreign army, we are going to have to make a deal with this very powerful country and accept that they're going to get basically 78% of British Mandatory Palestine if we can get 22% and some kind of arrangement for the refugees. And we can talk in great detail about what different Palestinians mean by that. I mean, on one end, at the most, we know that Saab Erekat suggested that Israel take 150,000 refugees in 2008, which, by the way, is not enough to change Israel's demographic character. It's actually, if Israel gives back the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem and takes 150,000 refugees, Israel actually ends up with fewer Palestinians than it does today. But anyway, we can go into all those details. But the point is, whether you believe that the divide is 50-50 or whether you believe the divide is 80-20 or whatever, there is a division, right? Hamas has a different politics than does Mahmoud Abbas and especially Salam Fayyad, right? So then the important question to me for Israel, it seems to me, is how do you strengthen group number 2 and weaken group number 1, right? That's a very, very important question for Israel, right? Israel had a leader as Palestinian Prime Minister in Salam Fayyad, for instance, who even a lot of people on the Israeli right thought was pretty good. Right? He was doing security cooperation with Israel. He was not contesting Israel's right to exist. In fact, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist formally in front of the entire world in 1993. Right? And so it's worth. He was committed to nonviolence. He was fighting against corruption. So it's worth noting what Salam Fayyad himself said about how the Israeli government treated him. Right? Since he was the closest thing the Palestinians have ever created to a Palestinian leader who you could bring home to mama, right? And so I think it's worth. Let me actually quote what Salam Fayyad said when he was leaving, when he was about to resign. This is an interview with Roger Cohen. You can find it in the New York Times in 2013. Quote: "Indeed, Israel never got behind me. In fact, it was quite hostile. The occupation regime is more entrenched, with no sign it is beginning to relinquish its grip on our life. We have sustained a doctrinal defeat we have not delivered. I represent the address for failure. Meanwhile, Hamas is strengthened." So the question is, if you have a group of Palestinians who are willing to accept Israel's right to exist and are doing security cooperation with the State of Israel, not perfect security cooperation, but some security cooperation. Israel today relies on security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The question is it smart to, and they're hoping that they're going to get a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And then you have Hamas, which does not recognize Israel's right to exist and is willing to fight forever until Israel is destroyed. Is it smart to say to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority who have accepted Israel's right to exist and who are hoping to get a state of their own, we're going to pay Israelis to move into the West Bank, into settlements, to make your state less and less viable, right? This is important. It's not just that Israel allows Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank. Israel pays Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank. In 2012, the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot did a study, and it found that the average settlement gets 70% more government money per person than does the average municipality inside the state of Israel, and that the 5 most heavily subsidized municipalities in the state of Israel are all settlements in the West Bank, that the settlers in Hebron get 7 times as much government money per person as do the residents of Beersheba in the Negev, right? So the question is that smart, right? Because what the Palestinians will then say is, okay, you say you want us to support a two-state solution, you want us to practice nonviolence, you want us to recognize your right to exist, but in fact, this is the way you treat the people who are doing that. So maybe actually Hamas is the only alternative. One of the most disturbing things that I have heard from Palestinians, and I've heard it several times now, and this is from Palestinian, I was talking to a Palestinian nonviolent activist in Hebron, and he said, I believe in nonviolence. He said, I didn't always believe in nonviolence, but I came to the belief in nonviolence because I believe that, not only because I believe that ultimately in the long run, it's the better way for us, because violence is so destructive for us. He said, but you know what my big fear is? That Israel only understands force. Because it's only when Hamas lobs rockets at Israel that Israel actually even really pays attention to the Palestinian question. When things are quiet, when there's no violence coming from Palestinians, Israel holds elections where the Palestinian question doesn't even come up very much. The last couple of Israeli elections were mostly fought over the price of cottage cheese. So it's very, very important that Israel take actions to strengthen those Palestinians who will be willing, reluctantly, willing to live alongside Israel, and to weaken those Palestinians who won't. And unfortunately, this government in particular, I think it often does the opposite. And that's why you find a remarkable number of, and this is the last sentence, you find a remarkable number of Palestinians who genuinely believe that Israel favors Hamas. Genuinely believe that Israel favors Hamas because they believe that Hamas wins concessions from Israel through its violent actions that leaders like Abbas and Fayyad have never been able to win through their nonviolent actions.
So let's play this out. Our friend Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a very, very fair-minded, wise man, said that my greatest nightmare is a Palestinian state, and my greatest nightmare is no Palestinian state. And my greatest nightmare is a Palestinian state because Israelis are worried that the establishment of an independent Palestinian state will slip into radicalism. It will become a base for ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah, take your pick of which bad guys, because the government will not be able to hold the center. And my greatest nightmare is no Palestinian state because the ongoing occupation of West Bank communities is unsustainable and it's corrupting to the state of Israel.
Right.
So tell us your vision.
Right.
So you become Prime Minister of the State of Israel tomorrow.
Right.
God help you, right? And you engineer a policy to bring this to a resolution. What's the Beinart plan?
Right. So the first thing I would say is this. I understand that some people may believe that a Palestinian state cannot be created tomorrow, or maybe should not be created tomorrow. We can have that argument. It seems to me that what the easier proposition is simply say we should not foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state ever, right? If you want to tell me that you don't think the Palestinian leadership today, because it's divided, or because Mahmoud Abbas is too weak, or because there's too much radicalism, or because the Palestinian educational process or whatever, that a Palestinian state is too dangerous today, and maybe Yossi, who's an old friend of mine, would say that, I would say, okay, is your long-term vision for permanent Israeli control over millions of stateless non-citizens under military law who lack the right to vote and lack free movement? If not, if you believe that ultimately one day a Palestinian state should be there, but just not now, I would say, okay, let's not foreclose the possibility. Let's at least agree that the Israeli government should not be paying people to move into the West Bank to make a Palestinian state more and more impossible so that Palestinians more and more give up on the very proposition. In fact, maybe let's agree that what the Jewish community around the world should be doing is raising money so that people who live in settlements can actually have the money to relocate inside the Green Line. A lot of those people are moved there for economic reasons, not ideological reasons. Most of them move move there for economic reasons because the Israeli government massively subsidized the building of relatively cheap housing in the Green Line that it wasn't building in the Negev or the Galilee or somewhere else. A lot of those people feel that they couldn't, no one would buy out their mortgages, they couldn't sell their homes. So let's go and buy their homes. Let's go and start, instead of inexorably increasing the settler population in the West Bank, let's stabilize and even begin to reduce it, right? So that at least we maintain the possibility of a Palestinian state one day. So I think that would be the first thing I would say in the Beinart plan. Just maintain the possibility of a Palestinian state someday by not inexorably increasing the settler population. The second thing is that I think it's important that Israel show that it is willing to accept a viable Palestinian state. A viable, even if it's not willing to have one tomorrow, that one day it would accept a viable. A viable Palestinian state has to be near the 1967 lines, and it has to have access to Jerusalem. Saying you're going to have a Palestinian state which doesn't have access to Jerusalem is, I don't know the geography here very well, but in New York, it would be like saying you're going to have a state in Westchester that doesn't have access to Manhattan, right? Jerusalem is the commercial, religious capital of the West Bank. If a Palestinian state if people don't have access, they can't move from the West Bank into East Jerusalem, the state has no chance of being viable. And so Israel has to say that someday it will accept the idea, not a Palestinian state that controls the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. So you have to be, at least in theory, be in favor of the idea of a Palestinian state. Yossi is right that a Palestinian state poses risks. It would be silly of me to get up here and say that I know with perfect certainty that a Palestinian state would not threaten Israel. There will be a lot of people in a Palestinian state who really don't like Israel very much, and that will also have a border with the rest of the Arab world. And I don't need to tell you that a lot of crazy and scary stuff is happening in the Arab world. But I think the question you have to ask is not, are there risks to a Palestinian state? The question is, what is the balance of risk? What is the greater risk? And again, it's not a surprise that Israel's security chiefs, who have to administer the West Bank. I don't know how any of you have seen the movie The Gatekeepers? Right? This is an interview with 6 former heads of the Shin Bet. These are the people who spent their lives trying to control the West Bank. And fundamentally, what they know is you're safer when the Palestinians have something to lose. There's nothing more dangerous than a group of people who have nothing to lose. When you are under military occupation and you see no possibility of having a situation where your children can live with some kind of dignity in their own country, you have very little to lose, and that's very dangerous. A Palestinian state, right, creates a whole infrastructure of people who have something to lose. Look at Israel's experience with its peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt. People say we can't have a Palestinian state because look how badly the disengagement with Gaza went. But there was no state created in Gaza. There was no peace agreement with Gaza. If you look at Israel's experience with peace agreements, with the agreements with Jordan and Egypt, they have served Israel very well. Even though Egypt has had a revolution and a counter-revolution, even though Israel has had, even though crazy and terrible stuff has happened in Egypt, the agreement has held in Egypt and with Jordan, even though there are a lot of people in Egypt and Jordan who also really, really don't like Israel. Why is it holding? Not because the leaders in Egypt and Jordan love Israel, but because they have a state, and they know that if they were to allow a lot of people to start launching lots and lots of rockets of Israel, that will be bad for them because Israel will retaliate and they'll be at war with the state of Israel, which is something that they know is bad for them. The leadership of those governments have something to lose. And if you don't give the Palestinians a state and you expect that the Palestinian Authority, which can't deliver anything for its people because it's not the apparatus of a state, is going to continue to patrol the West Bank for you forever when it's not providing anything for its people, ultimately I think you are in a situation where you're creating a population that has nothing to lose.
I want to move for a moment from Israel specifically back here to America. In 2010, you wrote a very, very important and provocative article. All your articles, by the way, have great titles. None of them are like quiet conservative titles. This one was called "The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment," right? The next one, which was the latest one you wrote, was called "The Final Collapse of the American Jewish Center." I'm waiting for the one just called Armageddon, and there's no article. It's just a blank page.
I don't always choose the titles, by the way.
No, but I'm telling you, I write titles for a living. I'm impressed, you know. This is a very important article. What you wrote in that article, if I could summarize it in 2 sentences, is young American Jews are abandoning their love of Israel because the Israel that they see is not the Israel they were promised. The Israel they were promised was a liberal democracy that believed in equality, that believed in non-military solutions to problems, that believed in respect for persons. And the Israel they encounter is less and less that, and more a country they can't abide. And you said that young American Jews are backing away or checking out altogether from their support of Zionism. I have a number of questions I want to ask. But the first one is the obvious one. That was in 2010. This is now 7 years later. Has it gotten better or worse?
I think it's gotten worse. I should say that political alienation from the Israeli government or from the way that the American Jewish establishment talks about the Israeli government is not the only reason that young American Jews don't feel connected to Israel, right? There's another very, very important reason they don't feel that connected to Israel. It's because they don't feel that connected to being Jewish, right? Israel is simply another Jewish thing, right? So if you've been raised if the community in which you were raised has not given you a decent Jewish education, if you've not been raised with experiences of joy in Jewish spaces, if you never had an experience of fascination with Jewish texts, if you've never occurred to you that you could actually go to Judaism and our text to actually help you answer some of life's difficulties, right? You never had an experience of Sukkot or Simchas Torah or Purim, it's not that likely you're going to feel that connected to Israel, right? So part of this problem is our failure, right? I mean, we are an incredibly successful community, in some ways the most successful Jewish community in history, and yet one of the least successful when it comes to educating our children about Judaism. And so we are dealing with the consequences of that in all kinds of ways, right? And we are in the lack of investment that I think we fundamentally. I mean, the fact that any American, my kids happen to go to Jewish day school, but goodness knows, I can tell you there are lots of problems with Jewish day school. I'm not suggesting that it's the only path. But the fact that the American Jewish community, but we do know that full-time Jewish day schools are an effective way of transmitting some minimal level of Jewish education and connection to Jewish identity. The fact that many American Jewish parents find Jewish day schools unaffordable, and that many of these day schools are so weak that basically you say, yeah, you're going to have to basically take out a second mortgage on your home, and by the way, the school doesn't have a basketball court or a science lab, but you should send your kids there because the most important thing you can do is instill them with a connection to Judaism. That's a disgrace. In a community as wealthy as ours, it should not be unaffordable to send your children to Jewish day school if you want to. And we have the weakest Jewish day school system of any large diaspora community. If you go to Australia, if you go to South Africa, if you go to Canada, if you go to England, you find that the Jewish day schools are more affordable, and oftentimes they're academically stronger. It's possible to do. We just have not decided as a Jewish community to do it. And the Israel disconnection is part of that. So that's one part of the story, which doesn't have anything to do with Benjamin Netanyahu. What you do find, however, is that even among often quite committed younger American Jews, there is also, who do care, there is often a sense of alienation, not just from the policies of the Israeli government, but even more so about an alienation from the conversation inside the organized American Jewish community. Because young American Jews grow up believing that one of the things they like about being Jewish is that we argue about everything, right? That's kind of our culture. And they think that's good, and they're proud of it. And then they find, lo and behold, that the thing that everyone seems to care about most, which is Israel, that you actually can't argue about it in the same way. That if you, in many spaces, if you ask really difficult questions, you get shut down or called a self-hating Jew. And that is very, young people like to ask questions that make their parents uncomfortable, right? That's what they do, right? That's good, right? That's why we celebrate the fact that we have 4 children, right, at the Pesach Seder. Only one of whom is polite, right? Only one of whom is providing his parents with nachas by the way he asks the question, right? But we celebrate the fact that all 4 of them, we have to answer all 4 of them. But that's not actually the way we do it in the organized Jewish community. And some of the questions are very tough, but you have to understand that they're also coming out of a very different lived experience than older American Jews are. There's this famous midrash that says, every generation hears the voice of Sinai anew, right? Younger America, the reason that we had a Zionist consensus in the United States, which started in the 1930s and 40s, was because of the idea of Zionism as refuge. The idea that the Jews of Europe were being slaughtered and they needed somewhere to go. Before that, in the early 20th century, vast swaths of the American Jewish community were anti-Zionist, didn't want a Jewish state. The Orthodox didn't want one because they were waiting for the Mashiach to come. The Reform didn't want one because they believed that Jews were a religion and not a people, and that our Zion was the United States. All of that got washed away by the Holocaust and the realization that we needed a state where Jews could go. Now, Jews, even Jews of my age, identify with Zionism as refuge. Because even though I don't remember the Holocaust, when I was in high school, kids I knew were going into the former Soviet Union with sidurs and cigarettes, and we were trying to liberate the Jews of the Soviet Union. And then we saw, and I remember seeing vast numbers of Soviet Jews going to Israel for refuge, right? So if you believe in Zionism as refuge, that's the place you need to go to be safe, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the Israeli government does. Even if you hate the government of Israel, you still need a Jewish state there. That's why during the Lebanon War and the First Intifada, even the fiercest American Jewish critics of Israeli policy never questioned the idea of Zionism itself, because Zionism as refuge was taken for granted. But younger kids, millennials, have never seen any large-scale exodus of Jews fleeing state-sponsored anti-Semitic persecution and going to Israel. And they don't feel that they need to do that themselves. So, if they are profoundly alienated from the policies of the Israeli government, they are likely to start asking difficult questions, the kind of questions that would have been heard in American synagogues 100 years ago, but not 50 years ago, about why there should be a state based on religious identity. After all, these are kids who grow up being very proud of the fact that we have separation of church and state in the United States. So someone comes along, sometimes it's it's the Palestinian kid living across the hall from them, and the Palestinian kid said, look, you're from New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey. In New Jersey, there's no religious identity. We don't want the Christian right to impose a religious identity in the United States. That's what it should be like in Israel-Palestine. One country, equal rights for everybody, no religion in the government. And the Jewish kid says, well, that's kind of interesting. Especially if he knows that the Israeli government also defines Judaism in a way that makes his or her form of Jewish observance, which is non-Orthodox, very, very difficult. And so the kid comes home with questions. Not, in my experience, generally like, convinced anti-Zionist, but questions about this enterprise. Like, what is a Jewish state? What makes a Jewish state okay? How do we reconcile the idea of a country that's supposed to treat everyone equally with the idea that it has a special obligation to one religious group, right? That it has religious symbols on its flag, which we would never want religious symbols on our flag, right? My point is not that kid is right. I actually spend a certain amount of my time trying to argue back to those kids. The point is you have to have the conversation with them. And what the organized American Jewish community generally tends to do now is if you cross certain lines, basically, well, then that conversation is not acceptable at Hillel. You are therefore essentially an adversary. And that instead of actually having a conversation about what a Jewish state is, what it should be, what kind of Jewish state is compatible with liberal democracy and what kind of Jewish state is not compatible with liberal democracy, if you don't meet that litmus test, basically you're trafe. And that is very alienating, often most alienating for the smartest and most inquisitive younger American Jewish kids. And that's part of what I was trying to get at that essay.
So at the climax of that essay, you have this line: saving liberal Zionism in the United States so that American Jews can help save liberal Zionism in Israel is the great American Jewish challenge of our age. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the article, you say there is a different Zionism calling. Mm-hmm. What's that new Zionism that's calling? What does it look like? How is it different from the Zionism that we see around us now?
So it starts with the idea that although Israel faces very genuine threats, that we also are threatened and challenged by the idea of Jewish power. That we are not in the equivalent circumstance to Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. That there has been a revolution in Jewish fortunes in the world, thank God. And it came about because many, many, many people fought and died for it. And so it starts by Benjamin Netanyahu has a tendency to describe, and it goes back to the beginning of his political career, all the way back in the late 1980s, essentially, to describe every moment as if it's 1938. The problem with that is the Jews of 1938 had no moral obligations to do anything other than survive. That was their only moral obligation. They had no power over anybody else. What Israel is an experiment in Jewish power, a revolutionary experiment where for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews have a state, and that state controls millions of people who are non-Jews. And so the question is, how do we respond to that challenge? It's not it's saying that we are saying that our only obligation is to survive is an evasion of that moral challenge. And so it seems to me that in Israel, the question is, what is the North Star? The North Star is Israel's Declaration of Independence and the idea that this will be a state that offers the right of citizenship and the right to vote and the right to live under the same law to all the people it controls, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. That's the North Star. And we can talk about how to get from point A to point B. Again, I said I would start with a settlement freeze. I would also start inside the Green Line with Arab Israelis. I think they're better described as Palestinian citizens of Israel, but we tend to call them Arab Israelis, by doing a series of things to make them feel like they're being treated more equally inside the state of Israel. A whole series of things, but I think partly it has to do with the structural problem is that Israel doesn't allow Arab Israeli parties into its governing coalitions. And because Arab Israeli parties are not in the governing coalitions, they always end up on the short end of the stick in terms of the allocation of resources. And I think doing things like making it illegal for Palestinians to commemorate the Nakba, or continually trying to go to the courts to prevent Palestinian Arab Israeli parties from being able to run in elections. I think this actually sends exactly the wrong message of non-inclusion. So I think there are a number of things you can do, but I think the North Star is a state that actually offers the right of citizenship to everyone under its control. And for those of us in Israel and the United States, we actually have a rich history to draw upon, I think, in terms of the question of how to think about Jewish power and the ethical responsibilities of Jewish power. But if we have a discourse which is only about Jewish survival, then essentially we liberate ourselves from the sense that we have a moral responsibility.
So to finish this part for a moment, the question is, in terms of activism, how do we affect Israeli policy? And I want to give one example because I think it's something that that affected a lot of people when they read your book. In your book, which is called The Crisis of Zionism, again, great titles, you talked about a limited boycott of goods. For a lot of people, that struck people as a first step toward BDS, which I know you condemn. But they felt that any boycott is a boycott, and this boycott leads to that boycott, and pretty soon you're boycotting. Is that really the best way to affect Israel? Can we affect Israel? Do Israelis care about what we think?
I think we can. I don't think, and I think the evidence that we can have an impact is the impact that the American Jewish community is able to have sometimes on the issue of the rights of non-Orthodox Jews. So you do find that American Jewish leaders are generally willing often to stand up and yell at the Israeli government when it has to do with our rights, right? When I actually happen to go to an Orthodox shul, but when I say our, I mean American Jews.
We'll take you.
I mean American, but even our Orthodox shul would have problems with the Israeli rabbinate. But the point is, when American Jews are willing to jump up and scream and shout about the fact that women cannot bring a Sefer Torah to the hotel, for instance, right? Or that it's very difficult to get any government support or even recognition for non-Orthodox forms of Jewish worship in Israel. And when American Jews scream and yell about that, the Israeli government takes no, because we are an anchor of Israel's relationship with the United States government. And there are not a lot of other superpowers that are getting in line to maintain Israel's military advantage, right? We provide American military aid is 20% of Israel's defense budget, right? We veto the resolutions at the UN. We give Israel diplomatic cover, right? Israel knows that the American Jewish community is a linchpin of that relationship, which is very, very important for it. So I do think we can have influence. Let me suggest a couple of other things besides the boycott of West Bank products that I think are valuable to do, if that one is a step too far from you, and then I'll talk about why I suggested that. One thing you could do, which I think is absolutely, absolutely important and maybe a little bit less controversial, is this. When American Jews go to Israel on synagogue trips or federation trips or birthright trips, I think it's absolutely essential that you interact with Palestinians. If you want to have a real experience of Israel, you can't have a real experience of a country if you don't have some interaction with the 50% of the people under the control of that country who are Palestinians. And one of the problems I think we have as a community is we talk about Palestinians incessantly and very rarely talk to Palestinians. And there's something pathological about constantly talking about people you never talk to. If you have a whole series of questions about why the Palestinians are doing all the horrible things they're doing, it's very, very important that you find an opportunity to ask those questions of Palestinians. Not some liberal Jew like me, but of actual Palestinians. And I also think that the experience of interacting with seeing Palestinian humanity, not Palestinians as a faceless mass of people who get up every morning just wanting to kill Jews, but of actual living, breathing human beings who turn out not to be so radically dissimilar from us, and listening to them talk about what it means to live for your entire life without a passport, under a state whose government you can't vote for, without citizenship, without the right to free movement, is a very, very powerful experience. And I think it's something that we should be willing to have, that American Jews should do when they go to Israel. So that's one thing. In terms of what I propose in the book, here's the argument. I believe that the greatest ally of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is Benjamin Netanyahu. The reason I believe that, and I believe that he and the BDS movement are silent allies. The reason they are silent allies is the BDS movement is led by people who don't want a two-state solution. They want one state. They might call it a secular binational state. I think in reality it would probably be a Palestinian-dominated state. They want one state from the river to the sea. They don't want there to be any Jewish state within any borders. They want a one-state solution. And what Benjamin Netanyahu is giving them is a one-state solution. As he erases the Green Line by paying more and more Jews to move into the West Bank and putting the final nails in the coffin of the two-state solution, they say, Terrific. Now we have one state. And the debate is going to be, is this going to be a state where millions of people lack the right to vote and lack citizenship, or is it going to be a state where everyone has citizenship and everyone has the right to vote? That's the debate they want. Don't just take it from me. I don't know if you've ever, who here knows who Omar Barghouti is, but Omar Barghouti is probably the most important BDS leader in the world. This is what Omar Barghouti said at Columbia University about a year and a half or so ago. I wrote it down. He said, "We've got to give credit to Netanyahu. Without him, we could not have reached this far at this time. It could have taken much, much, much longer. But with the help of the Israeli government, our biggest closet supporters in the world, we're going much faster." So for me, if you want to preserve a democratic Jewish state, and if you want to oppose the BDS movement, the most important thing you need to do is keep the possibility of the two-state solution alive. And so I have limited power to do that, but what I do have is I have a certain number of dollars that I'm going to spend in Israel. So I want to spend my money in democratic Israel, in the part of Israel where both Palestinians and Jews have citizenship and the right to vote and live under the same law, and I don't want to spend it in the part of Israel where only Jews have the right to vote and citizenship and live under a different legal system. And I was actually inspired to take this view by a number of Israelis who I really admire, the novelists David Grossman, Amos Oz, and Aleph Bet Yehoshua, all who have said, publicly wrote a letter saying that they were going to boycott the settlement of Ariel. In fact, the Weizmann Institute of Science, since the president of the Weizmann Institute of Science has more recently said, he too is going to boycott the settlement of Ariel. For me, it's like Havdalah, separation, a moral separation between democratic Israel and non-democratic Israel in an effort to preserve the existence of a democratic state. And the existence of a democratic Israel, I think, is ultimately our best defense against BDS. And if you believe that this effort to legitimize and affirm Israel's right to exist inside the Green Line while delegitimizing Israel's undemocratic occupation of the West Bank is a gift to the BDS movement, I would simply suggest that you're not listening hard enough to what the BDS movement is saying. Because in fact, the leaders of the BDS movement do not say that I am their great ally. They think that what I'm doing is actually a big problem for them because I'm actually trying to legitimize a part of Israel in the language of democracy. They would much, much rather have a one-state reality that they can condemn entirely as apartheid and try to overturn and turn into a non-Jewish state.
Oh, I have another 10 pages of questions. We haven't even talked about the president-elect yet. But tell you what, let's do this. Let's take a break. Let's get a stretch. Let's have a coffee and a brownie. And we'll come back in the second half, and you'll have a chance to ask some questions to our guest. Thanks very much. Come back in 5 minutes. Now you can clap.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm enjoying it.
Very, very good. Peter, what are we supposed to think? What are we supposed to do? What are we? Where? What? Why? When? What happened? What the hell is going on? I mean, the election was a shock to many people. To many people, it was a boon. Then the aftermath has been like it's like a reality show. It keeps getting better. I mean, each episode is getting. Rick Perry, the guy who couldn't remember the name of the agency, so they made him head of it. You couldn't write Saturday Night Live better than this. I mean, Alec Baldwin couldn't do Trump better than Trump does Trump. I mean, and I'm not being political. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing on TV. You write incisively not only about Israel and Jewish affairs, you write incisively about American politics. Your column about working class responsibility, I think, is an excellent column. It's in the Atlantic Monthly, and it's worth taking a look at, a read through. Very, very careful. Basically, Trump is the anti-Reagan. But from where you're sitting, you know, what are you What are you looking at? What are you feeling? What are you doing? What are you saying to your kids? You have 30 seconds. Use the mic. Use the microphone.
Yeah. Gosh, a lot of the time I'm just bewildered and scared, to be honest. So it's hard to organize the thoughts. I mean, I guess I would try to say a couple things. If you look at America in the middle of the 20th century, remember, Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again," right? It's not a surprise that he didn't appeal that much to African Americans, Latinos, LGBT folks, right? Because they don't have a memory of America being great one day. Back then, right, before civil rights, right, before when gay people had to be closeted, right? But there's a certain group of Americans, substantial group of Americans, especially older Americans, white Americans, more men, but some women, from whom there is an idealized image of that America. So what was that America? The America of the middle of the 20th century was an America in which racial and gender hierarchy was very clear. Everybody knew who was on top and everyone who was below. It was also an America that was far more economically equal than it is today, right? In which, especially after World War II, that you saw real economic growth in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s among working class people. It was in America very low immigration. Because remember, immigration was high in the early part of the 20th century, and then it was cut off in 1921 and 1924. And really, we didn't have a new wave of mass immigration until they changed the law in 65. There was very little immigration in the 20th century, and most of what there was from Europe. It wasn't from people who looked so different than the people who were already here. So low immigration. And also, America was much less economically globalized. America was much more economically independent. America was much less impacted by movements of capital and economic developments overseas, right? Corporations were much less mobile. Capital was much less mobile. So I think that's the return to that America. Stable, clear racial and gender hierarchies, greater economic equality, less immigration, and kind of being insulated from global economic forces. I think that was kind of what Trump was selling. And I think it was a powerful vision for a lot of people. The problem is that first of all, that it's not really attainable, those things, right? You can't turn back the clock to those things. Turning back the clock to those things would be very brutal for people who have over the last 50 years have managed to get some greater sense of equality, previously, disenfranchised and marginalized groups. And also that Trump's whole vision of how government works doesn't show a lot of respect for the rule of law. And that's very frightening. It's very important to remember that America is not simply a democracy, it's a liberal democracy. The framers of the Constitution actually were very frightened of democracy in the sense that they believed that although the people should have a voice in their government, they also knew that the majority of people at times, the mob, might at times decide that they wanted to snuff out the rights and do very, very bad things to unpopular minorities. That's why we have a lot of institutions in our government that are not all that democratic. The Supreme Court, for instance, right? You appoint these people to the Supreme Court, they interpret the Constitution, they can stop the American people from doing what they want through their elected members of Congress and president, and you can't do anything about it. They're there for life because they're supposed to protect the Constitution and especially the Bill of Rights and those guarantees of liberty that we have. And I think what we see in Trump is a kind of, this is a term that Fareed Zakaria used many years ago, potential for a kind of illiberal democracy. A democracy in which the majority of the moment, in fact, ironically, it wasn't even a majority because he lost the popular vote, but the people who were able to elect the president now potentially have the ability to really run roughshod over vulnerable minorities and to not respect the institutions that provide checks and balances that limit the power of the president. Our system was based on the idea that power corrupts. And so you want to limit the power of the president because if they get too much power, it's likely to be more and more corrupting. And that, I think, is the danger that we face. Here's a guy who went after a sitting federal judge. is a guy who threatened Jeff Bezos, the editor of the Washington Post, that because he didn't like the Post coverage of him, that there should be an antitrust investigation of Jeff Bezos' tax situation. A guy who has continually incited his supporters against the press, and now a guy who's waging this kind of weird campaign against America to discredit America's intelligence agencies, and who wants the military to do things that are a clear violation of its own code of ethics. I think the most important question for us today is to try to strengthen the institutions that check the power of the president, preserve our constitutional system, and preserve the rule of law. That's the press, it's the independent judiciary, it's a Congress, a legislative branch that is not simply going to go along with whatever Trump wants because he's a Republican, but stand up for its constitutional prerogatives. I mean, my goodness, we have all of the intelligence agencies now saying that Russia intervened in the election to try to elect Donald Trump. And a lot of Republicans in Congress are still reluctant to even want to do an investigation of this, right? That is their obligation as members of Congress to try to investigate it and to safeguard the integrity of our political system, regardless of the party of the person who's in the White House. So I think the challenge for all of us is to try to safeguard those elements of our political system against the potential abuse that Donald Trump represents and against the potential abuse that any other American president represents. It's a scary moment. It's a scary moment, and it's going to be a test unlike we've ever seen of how strong our system of government and our institutions actually are.
Good. We're going to take some questions, so let me explain how we do this. Louise Spitzer, who is our wonderful monitor, has the microphone. The person who gets the mic gets to ask the question. Before you ask, Louise, hang on just 1 second. Stay right there. A question at Valley Beth Shalom. You all know this by heart now. A single sentence interrogatory which begins with the words what, where, why, when, or how, and ends with a question mark. You go to the second sentence, I interrupt you. You go to the third sentence, we take the microphone away. This is not your opportunity to give a sermon. If you'd like to give a sermon, we would love to hear your sermon. You come any Shabbos morning to Stephen Weiss Temple, to Temple Beth Am, to Sinai Temple, to Temple Judea. You tell the rabbi that Rabbi Feinstein sent you, and you give your sermon. You can even come to here and give a sermon on a Shabbos morning. I'll let you do it, but not tonight. We're here to hear a guest expound on his perspectives on the world. And when we finish in the parking lot, you can stand in the middle of the lot and give the sermon, and people will come to hear you. So, a one-sentence question that gets our guest to expound on a particular idea. Mrs. Spitzer has the ultimate authority. You insult her, God help you. Rabbi Levy.
First of all, thank you for being here, and I really do appreciate your sincerity, because I really do feel the sincerity
Now your question,
in what
sir.
you're saying. Okay, I'm a rabbi, I give a sermon. So the question is, when you talk about even a limited boycott of goods from Judea and Samaria, do you buy Chinese products? Do you use an Apple computer? And if so, do you boycott China because of their occupation?
Good question.
Of territories.
Right.
So the question is about the limited boycott of goods from the settlements.
Right.
Please.
Right. No, I don't boycott Chinese goods. There are other things that I boycott, but the reason I boycott products from the West Bank and Gaza and not products from China, although I do support various forms of American pressure on China, is that I care about Israel and its future much more than I care about the future of China. So I devote my attention to doing things that I think are in Israel's interests in a way that there are many, many issues that I don't focus on nearly as much, because my children's future is not bound up with the survival of China it's not a democracy, but the moral character of China, its sustainability, the consequences of it controlling Tibet do not have the same impact on my life as does Israel's future. I'm not a pure universalist. What happens in Israel, what happens to the Jewish people is more important to me, which is why I wrote a book about Israel Israel and not a book about China. Once I wrote a book about Israel, I had to try to figure out what I could suggest people do to try to change the very, very dangerous path that Israel is on, and this was a proposal I made. So that's the answer for why. It's a little bit like saying, in the 1970s, a lot of American Jews used to go and have protests outside the Bolshoi Ballet and call for protests and boycotts against the Soviet Union. So someone can come along and say, wait a second, you're hypocrites. Don't you know that what the Khmer Rouge are doing in Cambodia and Idi Amin is doing in Uganda is much worse than what the Soviets are doing to the Jews in Russia? And the Jews would have said, yeah, maybe it is worth, but we care more about this because we're Jews. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Question?
Yes.
Could you stand up so we can see you? Thanks. It'll just be easier to hear you.
You know, as a people, I think Jews have always prided themselves for trying to be a light unto the nations. And in that regard, what I'm wondering about is if you have any ideas how we as Jews, as a community, and as really just citizens of this country, can ensure that civil rights and the other rights that we're talking about are actually protected. And I don't know, I question the effectiveness in going out to march on the streets, but I'm just wondering if there's anything
the question.
you
Right.
see.
Great question.
Right. Well, so one of the things I think something we can do here, which is very, very important in this particular moment. It's not about Israel, but it's about the United States. Is to try to find ways of showing solidarity and protection for American Muslims. I think that this has been a frightening moment for American Jews, but just imagine what it's been like for American Muslims. I mean, if a presidential candidate had come out and said the things about American Jews that Donald Trump has said about American Muslims, we would be having a serious conversation about mass aliyah. I mean, if a president had said no more Jewish immigration to the United States and had thrown around these lies like Jews had celebrated the 9/11 attacks, right, and had appointed a national security advisor like Michael Flynn, who said Islam is not actually a religion, it's just a political ideology, and it's a cancer, we would be absolutely terrified. And that is the way that a lot of American Muslims feel. Absolutely terrified. I mean, the Muslim parents that I knew, you think that our kids were scared the day after 9/11? They either didn't send their kids to school or walked with their kids to school and stayed with their kids at school until they felt like the kids were okay, right? There's a tremendous, tremendous amount of fear. I think a great example is what Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL said recently, which is to say, if there's going to be a registration in which people are going to start registering American Muslims, sign me up first, right? We know this in our bones. We know that we know what this kind of fear is like, and we have some position in this society where we can have some influence. And ultimately, it's also for our own good. It's also for our own self-protection, right? And this is why, this is why I think we have to, and I know there are supporters of AIPAC in the room, and there are things that AIPAC does that I agree with. But when AIPAC has Donald Trump to speak after he proposed a ban on all Muslim immigration and treats him just like any other presidential candidate, which is as long as you say the right things about Israel, you are fine. Because AIPAC is the most powerful Jewish organization in the United States, the most powerful Jewish organization in Washington. We take no moral responsibility for what happens in our own country. As long as you say the right things about Israel, anything you want to do in terms of the United States is okay, which is why AIPAC didn't put out a single criticism of Donald Trump throughout the campaign. The Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations didn't put out a single criticism, didn't even put out a press release when he said he was going to ban an entire faith. No, I don't think that's right. We have a greater moral obligation than that. And I think, by the way, it's also a pretty good way to fight anti-Semitism. It's also a pretty good way to fight anti-Semitism because what you do is you actually create connections with people, real connections with people, and actually those form the human bonds that the next time that Muslim hears from their imam or some person on the radio that Jews are evil or Jews are like this, they say, well, you know, Mrs. Feinberg seemed like a lovely person. And actually, she was of a lot of comfort to me at a moment where I was very scared. So you're also fighting anti-Semitism.
Where's the mic? Please.
Yes. One, I share your concerns about checks and balances with the democratic institutions. Last week we had dinner with a congressman, remained nameless, but he was the chairman of the Oversight Committee, the richest member of Congress. And I said to him, are you going to do the same thing with President Trump that you did with President Obama? And he said, well, that's not my job. You know, now my job is to go after illegal immigrants. So I don't think Congress is going to do anything. I don't think the judges are going to do anything.
What's your question, sir?
My question is, our daughter just recently went to work for the Washington Post. So my question is, what can the fourth estate do different, because he's playing the media better than anyone ever did? And what can the fourth estate do uniquely in today's media world that really starts challenging and questioning for most of the citizenry what I fear he's going to become, and nobody will be really recognized? And
Right,
how
thank
can
you.
the fourth estate do that?
Good. You're a journalism professor in your spare time, right?
You know, it's difficult because the media is not one thing, right? The media is a whole different series of institutions that operate in completely different ways, right? And who have responded to this election in completely different ways. And I actually think newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, I mean, I'm not out in LA, so I don't read the LA Times as much, but I would imagine them too, have actually done a lot that they can be proud of. I mean, one of the problems that newspapers have is that the traditional model for newspapers has been that if you have two candidates, right, one of them says A and one of them says B, and then you report A and B, and you let the readers decide, right, because you're supposed to be objective, right? But that system can be abused, right, by a candidate who's willing to lie as brazenly as Donald Trump is willing to lie, right? And so I think, to their credit, the New York Times and the Washington Post have become much more willing to say outright that things Donald Trump has said are just outright falsehoods, right? That it's not a matter of opinion whether, whether Ted Cruz's father was involved in assassinating John F. Kennedy, right? That's just nuts, right? I mean, or that millions of people voted illegally in this election and for Hillary Clinton, right? So I think that now the more, there's a different kind of challenge for TV, right? Part of the problem is with Donald Trump. First of all, he's extremely entertaining, right? And these are ultimately you need, you are a news organization, but you survive by getting people to actually watch, right? And it turned out that Donald Trump's speeches were really fun to watch, and Jeb Bush's speeches were really not fun to watch, right? So people said to CNN, it's really terrible that you broadcast Donald Trump and not Jeb Bush, but that's what people wanted to watch. And also, from the moment he entered the race, Donald Trump, when the Republican primary, was at the top of the polls. So here you had the Republican frontrunner, who was also somebody who people were really interested in, so you gave him a lot of airtime, right? And then you might very well follow that with a panel of people who said, you know what Donald Trump said was wrong and terrible and blah, blah. But the truth is that the Trump supporters in particular, and Republicans in general, have such a low regard for the media, who they tend to believe is biased, dominated by liberals. It is often dominated by liberals. I mean, the media in general, I don't think it's biased in some of the same ways they think it is. But the point is that those talking heads, and I do that too, a fair amount, those talking heads saying Donald Trump is wrong, not going to have any impact on those folks, right? So it's a very significant challenge. I think that it's very important that the media continue to do investigative reporting, the newspapers do, about what's actually happening, especially about things like corruption. And it's very important that that get wide circulation. But unfortunately, we live in a very fractured media environment where many people are getting their news curated through social media and essentially only getting news streams that already reinforce what they already believe. So it's hard to penetrate that bubble. And again, this is not something which is unique to the right. This is the world in which we live, and it's having, I think, very disturbing consequences.
Don't you think 1960 was a pivotal year in American politics because it was the year television took over politics? Those who heard the Nixon-Kennedy debate thought Nixon won.
Right.
Those who watched it, hands down, thought Kennedy won.
Right.
I think this election represents another shift.
Right.
You have a whole new set of media of mechanisms. What's amazing is that in 1968, Nixon learned how to use television and came back and won. You wonder whether someone on the other side is going to come back and out-Trump Trump using Twitter, Facebook, and other kinds of media mechanisms.
Right.
And if Bernie Sanders had been 40 years younger and more entertaining, you wonder what could have happened in this election. Where's the next question? Who's got the microphone? Eddie.
What do you see as the mid to long-term implications for American Jewry of divisions over Israel and the accompanying rhetoric?
The divisions among American Jewry. I think that Israel is becoming less and less a source of consensus and unity among American Jews, and more a source of division. And it's not only because of Israel. The division of Israel in some ways is a symptom of a more fundamental and profound division, which is to say we are a community that's polarizing along religious lines, which is to say that the growth is happening on the Orthodox side and among people who have no religious affiliation at all, right? People who are not connected to any of the movements. So the most secular and the most religious are where the population growth is. The middle, right? You represent the middle, right? The conservative movement was always the middle between Reform and Orthodoxy. And as non-Orthodox Jews who connect to a synagogue, you represent the middle, which used to be dominant. That used to be what most American Jews were. They were not Orthodox, but they had a connection to a synagogue. Now there are more and more Orthodox Jews, and of the non-Orthodox Jews, fewer and fewer of them have a connection to a synagogue. So the problem is that those people, right? Kids who are growing up in a very closed Orthodox ecosystem, right? The Orthodox now overwhelmingly send their kids to Jewish day school, right? They're overwhelmingly in an Orthodox bubble. And kids who are growing up in a highly assimilated, very secular environment are just having radically different life experiences. The one is extremely tribal. The other one is extremely universalistic. So when they come to Israel, they're coming at it from completely different prisms, right? The universalistic perspective is, well, I care as much about the Palestinians as I do about the Jews, and Israel looks like the bad guy because they're the most powerful one, and they're holding the Palestinians without rights. And the Orthodox one comes from this very, very, very strong sense of solidarity, and especially the currents coming out of the Orthodox community in Israel, which are very, very much on the Israeli right. And so it turns out that those kids have a lot of difficulty communicating with one another because their fundamental values are so different. And that's why I think that part of our challenge, even beyond Israel, is to find a way for different groups of American Jews to interact with one another and see what they have in common. And I think that more fundamentally than Israel, the thing that we should look to as the thing we have in common is Jewish texts, which is the most fundamental thing we have in common is Torah. And that what I would love to see would be from Jews from radically different perspectives coming together to actually study our tradition together, to try to gain meaning from the text that we share together. Now, again, that may seem a little bit fanciful, but I think that if we can get I engage in political discussion about Israel for a living, so I'm not against it. But I think in terms of what I am grateful for is that if I look at the relationships I have with people who completely disagree with me on Israel, think what I write about Israel is worse than what some of you guys think about what I say about Israel. The reason that we maintain our relationship is because we share bonds together. We go to shul together. We celebrate simchas together. Our kids go to day school together. We have a network of connecting institutions that go beyond Israel. And I would like people to think about how we can build those connections that are based on something other than politics between American Jews of different experiences and perspectives.
Thank you. Who has the mic?
I do.
Hi, Douglas.
Mr. Beinart, I am one of those that Rabbi Feinstein talked about. I probably read just about everything you write and don't agree with a thing of it. The question that I have for you is, last week we hosted Tal Becker, and Mr. Becker talked about a bigotry of low expectations. The Palestinians have been offered a state on 3 different occasions, twice with Arafat and Barak, and once with Olmert and Abu Mazen. How does that factor into your equation when you sit there and talk about Israel?
Right. Okay. Good question. I think it's very important to talk about this. We have a narrative in much of the American Jewish community which says the Palestinians were offered a great deal and they said no. Right. If you read we actually have a literature on what happened at Camp David and then at Taba. We have a literature about what happened in 2007 and 2008 between Olmert and Abbas. We have a literature about the Kerry negotiations in 2013-14. We have even a scholarly literature and a lot of literature from a lot of professors. Almost nobody who has actually studied that literature believes that narrative. Almost nobody. It's the literature, it's the narrative that we tell ourselves again and again and again, but there's very little empirical basis for it. The reality is that both in 2001, and again in 2007 and 2008, what happened was that there was a difference between the Israeli and Palestinian positions. So you can say that the Palestinians rejected the Israeli position. You can also say that the Israelis rejected the Palestinian position, right? So to give you an example, right, to go into details, and I will try not to go on too long about this, but in the summer of 2000 at Camp David, there's some discrepancy about the Barak offer because it was not written down. It was conveyed orally through the Americans. But the best evidence seems to be that Barak's offer was for Israel to annex 9% of the West Bank, keep Israeli troops in the Jordan Valley for 12 years, and give the Palestinians the outer Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, but not the inner Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. From Israeli perspective, that was a remarkable offer. It went far beyond what the Israelis had offered before. From the Palestinian perspective, it was not a good offer. Because, for instance, annexing 9% of the West Bank meant that Israel would annex the settlement of Ariel, which, if you look at a map, stretches very, very deep into the West Bank, in the northern section of the West Bank, and basically cuts off the northern Palestinian cities of Qalqilia and Tulkarm from the West Bank. The Palestinian offer, and this is not just from Palestinian sources, this is what Gilad Sher has written, who was Barak's chief negotiator, was for about a 2.5% land swap, equal land swap. Barak was willing to give he wanted to annex 9%, he was willing to trade 1% of land inside the Green Line in return. The Palestinian offer was for an equal 2.5% land swap because they didn't want Israel to annex Ariel. They said you have to dismantle Ariel. Now, the Israeli position was, that's crazy. That map that you're presenting is totally indefensible from a security perspective because what Israel wanted was to basically draw circles around settlements and create settlement blocks. What the Palestinians were willing to say is you can control some settlements, but we're not going to build a circle around them. There's going to be a small line connecting the Green Line out to those settlements, and Israel said from a security perspective that's a non-starter. My point is not to say which is wrong, right or wrong. It was, the Palestinians also said you can't keep troops in the Jordan Valley for 12 years. That's 25% of our land. You're going to be occupying it for another 12 years. So again, also in 2007, 2008, Olmert goes further than Barak. He says we want to annex 6.3%, we'll trade you 5.7%. The Palestinians say we want a 1.9% equal land swap. The point is there was a negotiation in which the two sides had different perspectives, right? It is not correct to say that the Palestinians were offered everything they could have wanted and they said no. If you look, in fact, at Clinton, in December of 2000, laid out the Clinton parameters, where he tried to lay out from an American perspective a kind of set of parameters that he hoped both sides could agree upon, right? He talked about that the Palestinians would have 94 to 96% of the West Bank, and they would get 1 to 3% of Israel proper. So that would end up being between 95 and 99. And he said that Israel would have to remove its troops from the Jordan Valley in 3 years. I could go on about the different ways. If you take the Clinton parameters as your baseline, and you look about what we know about Abbas's position and what we know about Netanyahu's position, Abbas is far closer to the Clinton parameters than Benjamin Netanyahu is today. The Palestinians have put on the table a land swap, which is, again, similar, about a 2% land swap. The Palestinians have called for a 3 to 5, even 5-year transition in the Jordan Valley. Benjamin Netanyahu's position is that Israeli troops must stay in the Jordan Valley indefinitely, right? And he has never been willing to accept even the principle of the 67 lines plus swaps. In fact, according to Ben Caspit, one of Israel's most prominent journalists, and the American negotiators, Benjamin Netanyahu, during the Kerry negotiations, never proposed a map at all, never made any territorial proposal. And indeed, last summer, Benjamin Netanyahu said that he could never accept any Palestinian state which did not have Israeli troops on it, right? So my point is that this story is not the story that I think is often told from the American Jewish organizational perspective. It's not to say the Palestinians didn't make mistakes and there isn't blame. Certainly, the resort to violence in the Second Intifada, which started in September of 2000, was a colossal, not just error, but crime. That for which the Palestinians themselves, as well as Israelis, paid mightily. And we can talk about the roots of that. It was led by younger Tanzim militia, but Arafat acquiesced to it. That I am not letting the Palestinians off blameless. But this, if there's one thing I want you to come away with from this night, this story that we keep telling ourselves is not rooted in fact.
Who has the mic?
Hi. So given the results of the election and the appointment of people like Steve Bannon, how do you see the status or position of Jews in America changing, if you do? And if so, how do you see that impacting the relationship of Jewish Americans to Israel?
So American Jews now have this interesting decision to make, right? I mean, we have set up an organizational structure where we have a lot of institutions, our most powerful institutions, look at political leaders, and they basically ask this question: do you support Benjamin Netanyahu's right to do whatever he wants? And if you answer yes, you're kosher, right? That's all that matters, right? And that is, in fact, and it's very interesting. If you look at the way that some American Jewish organizational leaders have responded to criticisms about what Steve Bannon has said, or other people on the alt-right who've made anti-Semitic comments, their response is always, those people are really pro-Israel, right? It actually happens, I mean, I'm not calling Steve Bannon an anti-Semite, but it's worth noting that it is entirely possible to both be an anti-Semite and be pro-Israel, right? At a very elementary level, if you don't like the Jews here, you might like the idea that they could go somewhere else, right? The Polish government between World War I and World War II was extraordinarily Zionistic. So Zionistic that they actually trained members of the Beitar Zionist militia to fight in Palestine. They sent some of their own officers to do that. Why? Because they had a lot of Jews in Poland and they wanted them to go somewhere else, right? So the point is, are you going to maintain that? Is that going to be your prism? Or are you going to say, we feel we have a responsibility for what happens here too, right? In which case, we're going to also judge, Trump and Steve Bannon and these people on that criteria as well. And that would obviously be what I would prefer, because I think that we have built a set of institutions that wield power. That's to our credit. We have done so because we've used the democratic process. We are politically articulate community, and we use the political process to wield power. And it seems to me we have a moral obligation to wield that power not only on behalf of what we think is good for the state of Israel. I mean, I happen to think that often the way we wield it isn't good for the state of Israel, but not only for what we think is good for the state of Israel, but also what's good for the United States. We're citizens. We have an obligation to what happens to our fellow citizens here. And that, I think, has to be the kind of fundamental perspective. Now, that doesn't mean you have to get involved in having a press release about every tax dispute. I'm not saying that you need to, but there's certain fundamental questions, it seems to me, which have to do with equal rights, especially for vulnerable groups, where the American Jewish community has a responsibility to speak, and I hope that will happen.
You daven in an Orthodox shul. Members of your shul support Trump?
That's interesting. I belong to an unusual Orthodox shul. Maybe that's why I remember.
Let me ask the question more generically. Why did so many Orthodox Jews support Trump?
So why did so many Orthodox Jews support Trump? I mean, I think you have to start with the reality that most Orthodox Jews are simply Republicans, right?
Why are so many Orthodox Jews Republican?
First of all, because Orthodox Jews are much more likely to be single-issue Israel voters than non-Orthodox Jews are. Most American Jews don't vote on Israel primarily. Orthodox Jews are much more likely to vote on Israel because they're much more connected to Israel. They're much more likely to have spent time in Israel. They're much more likely to have family in Israel. And they're also, when they define what being pro-Israel means, they're more likely to define that as being on the right because the Orthodox community in Israel is further to the right. So that's part of it. The other reason that Orthodox Jews vote Republican is that a lot of non-Orthodox Jews vote Democratic because they're afraid of the Christian right and they believe in the separation of church and state. And Orthodox Jews Orthodox Jews have a very different perspective on the separation of church and state. Orthodox Jews, in fact, are basically are drowning in day school tuition bills and would be very happy if some Christian evangelicals came along and gave them some tax credits or some money so they could help pay for their astronomical day school bills. And so that, plus because they're more culturally conservative, they're not passionately supportive of gay marriage. It's not necessarily that they're voting for someone because they're anti-gay marriage, but they're not repelled by someone being anti-gay marriage. And I also think, to be honest, that the Orthodox community has, like American Jews in general, but in the Orthodox community, especially in the last generation, has attained a lot of wealth. And there are a lot of people in the Orthodox community, and this is not only Orthodox Jews, there are other American Jews too, but I think it's especially prevalent in the Orthodox community, where I think people tend to be probably a little bit less likely to be, well, I think there's some difference in professions, a little bit, but oftentimes I think what you find is that it is more kosher to say that you're going to vote for the Republican because that person is pro-Israel than that you're going to vote for the Republican because they're going to lower your taxes. Because saying you're going to do it because they're going to lower your taxes sounds kind of selfish, and saying you're going to do it because they're more pro-Israel sounds kind of more high-minded. So sometimes Israel acts as a kind of a mask for a set of economic concerns that are underlying this. Now, to be fair, I think Orthodox Jews voted less heavily for Trump than they would have voted for Marco Rubio, let's say, because I think there were people who were genuinely disconcerted by his view, but I think the animosity to the Democratic Party is so strong in many sectors of the Orthodox community that basically they were going to vote for whoever the Republicans put up. Plus the fact that he has an Orthodox daughter-in-law, I think, allayed some concerns. Daughter. Oh, sorry, daughter. Yeah, daughter. Son-in-law and daughter, yes, sir.
In a two-state solution, does the West Bank have to be Judenfrei? Or can the West Bank be a democratic Islamic republic with Jews and Arabs, as Israel is a democratic, Jewish democratic country with Jews and Arabs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not only can it be, it must be. I think it's very important to say that Jews absolutely have the right to live in a Palestinian state, right? There are places in in the West Bank that are very, very important to Jews, right? The West Bank is more biblically significant than Israel inside the Green Line. If you think about Hebron and Nablus, which the Bible calls Shechem, and Beit Lechem, where again we just also read this in this week's parsha that Beit Lechem, or on the road to Efrat, right, which is settlement is where Rachel is where Rachel died. Yes, it's very important that Jews be able to live in those places. But they have to be willing to live as equal citizens under the same law. And that means they can't live in religiously, ethnically segregated communities, which is to say, if a Palestinian wants to move into Efrat or Male Adumim or Kiryat Arba and buy a house next to you, they have to be able to do that because you're living under the same legal system. Right now, Jews live as citizens next to Palestinians who don't have citizenship, which is part of the reason that settlers use something like 5 times as much water per person as Palestinians do, because the government is responsive to them, it's not responsive to the Palestinians. In fact, there is a myth that the Palestinians will not allow that the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, will not allow any Jews to live in a Palestinian state. Now, to be fair, we don't know what would happen if there were a Palestinian state, but what we do know is this, because this came out in the Al Jazeera papers, which were this whole massive amount of leaks of the negotiations between Abbas and Olmert, particularly between Saeb Erekat and Tzipi Livni. The Palestinians proposed that Male Adumim, right, significant settlement, which is east of Jerusalem, be annexed in a Palestinian state. That was their proposal. Israel wanted to annex Male Adumim. The Palestinians said, we have a problem with you annexing Male Adumim. Our proposal is that Male Adumim stay within the Palestinian state. Right? That was actually their proposal. Behind closed doors, that's what they asked. And you know what Israel said? What Livni said, which is very interesting. It's important to think about this. Livni said, no, we can't allow any Jews to remain inside a Palestinian state. Because from the Israeli perspective, it actually makes sense to be worried about having a Jewish population inside the West Bank, right? Because what happens if they're threatened? Israel has a responsibility to protect Jews around the world. It would have a responsibility to protect Jews in the West Bank. So if the Jews in Male Adumim found themselves threatened by Palestinians, the IDF would have to go into the Palestinian state to protect them. So Tzipi Livni said, no, either we annex them or we clear them out. We're not going to have Jews living under your sovereignty because that will create a burden for us of having to protect them. And that's a genuine practical problem with having Jews in a Palestinian state. But as a matter of principle, I think you were absolutely right. It's very important that we maintain the principle that Jews have the right to live as equal citizens in a Palestinian state.
Who has the mic? Marcia, stand up. Thank you. Thank you.
You mentioned very briefly that comparing the Trump's comment about the Muslims to Jews as a discrimination, and I think I was a little confused because the Jews are not inciting violence all over the world, which is what's happening within Islam in the Mideast, and I believe that's one reason why he wanted to limit Muslims coming to this country. And along that same line, is not Islam, which is a political ideology in addition to a religion, isn't that a big factor in the Palestinian desire to not have Jews live in Israel?
Okay,
And
good
how is
question. Is Islam a political ideology?
Islam definitely has political teachings, right? It has more political teachings actually than Judaism does because more Islamic texts were written under conditions of when Muslims had sovereignty, right? Most of our core texts were generally written when Jews did not have sovereignty. So though we do have some discussion, especially I think if you look in Navi, if you look in the discussion of the Jewish monarchs, right? If you look at Saul, David, and Solomon, there are political teachings and political ideology, and some of it, it's worth noting, is to the modern sensibility, highly, highly disturbing, right? Why does who here knows why Saul lost his kingship? Okay, you know, right? Saul lost his kingship, right? The kingship was the prophet Shmuel, the prophet Samuel takes the kingship and gives it to David. Why? Because he does not exterminate the Amalekites. He allows King Agag to live, and he doesn't kill all of their animals, right? He's not ruthlessly genocidal enough. Right? So this is why I have, and a nice gentleman asked me this question, but this is why I have a problem when people say, go read the Quran, it has all this terrible stuff in it, right? Our texts have a lot of terrible stuff in it too. Thank God we have an interpretive tradition which tells us that we don't know who the Amalekites are, so you don't have an obligation if you see an Amalekite at the bus stop to try to kill him, right? Because the rabbis, thank God, said we don't know who the Amalekites are anymore, right? Islam has a variety of interpretive traditions, right? Some of them are horrifying and very, very disturbing and murderous, like the imams who justify what ISIS does. Some of them are very different than that, right? A Sufi tradition, for instance, which is much more moderate and kind of mystical. So I think fundamentally, when you're talking about a religion of 1.6 billion people, right, that is spread across vast swaths of the entire world, right? Some countries that have had, Muslim countries that are democracies, that have had female leaders, that are actually not producing a lot of terrorists, Indonesia, for instance, that one has to be careful of making these sweeping statements, and one should not make all Muslims bear the burden of what ISIS is doing, right? In fact, partly it's not fair to them, right? There are millions of Muslims living in our own country. The vast majority of them have never hurt anybody, right? And secondly, it also plays directly into ISIS's hands, because what ISIS wants to be is the spokesman for all Muslims and all of Islam, and what it wants to tell Muslims is, we are defending you against the West, who will never treat you equally and who are fundamentally hostile to you, and so you have to take our side in this civilizational war, right? So basically treating all Muslims as if they are members of ISIS guilty as members of ISIS until proven innocent is actually a great way of strengthening ISIS. So that's why I think that the blanket policy that Donald Trump has adapted is a mistake, and it's actually worth noting that it's even George W. Bush and a lot of other Republicans talked in a very, very different way about Islam than Trump has been doing.
Okay, who has the mic? I'm sorry to everyone else who has hands, but this will be our last question.
Okay. What, if any, role does Jordan have or can have in a two-state solution?
So that's an interesting question. Jordan, one role that Jordan would certainly have is patrolling the eastern border of a Palestinian state, which would be a border with Jordan, right? So in the proposals that have been, most of the proposals that have been thrown around in negotiation, there would be some kind of international force in the Jordan Valley. That international force, there would be an Israeli force that would transition to an international force on the Palestinian side of the Jordan River, and on the other side, you would have Jordanian forces. So the ability to work in tandem with those Jordanian forces to prevent members of ISIS from being able to cross into a Palestinian state would be would be important. It's also very important that Jordan support any Palestinian leader who accepts a two-state solution, right? Just as an Israeli leader who accepts a two-state solution will be subject to tremendous cries of betrayal from Jews who oppose that, right? I mean, we don't have to remind you that an Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated for not even making it, for even negotiating towards a Palestinian state. It will be a very dangerous political situation for an Israeli leader. It'll be also very dangerous for a Palestinian leader, because any Palestinian leader who agrees to a deal will have to agree to a deal which does not give Palestinians everything they want on the refugees. So it's very, very important that that Palestinian leader have the support of the leader of Jordan and of the leader of other Arab countries to support and legitimize him, or maybe, God willing, her. And that's also why the Arab Peace Initiative, sometimes called the Saudi Peace Initiative, is very significant. In 2002, the entire Arab League said that they would all recognize Israel's right to exist if Israel returned to the 67 lines and there was a just and agreed upon solution to the refugee problem. That was re-offered again in 2007. And then in 2013, they said that it didn't even have to be the Green Line. There could be land swaps so Israel could keep some of the settlements. The Arab Peace Initiative is very, very important because it creates the possibility, it holds out the possibility that Israel has peace agreements not just with the Palestinians but with the entire Arab world. And it's very important, I think, for us to try to strengthen those Arab leaders who initiated that and for Israel to show that it is open to that kind of agreement. Again, even if not tomorrow, at least one day, so that ultimately you can have the entire Arab world getting behind a two-state solution.
You know, you have to always end a Torah reading on a line of Nechemta, and you've given us a lot to worry about, right? I hope you took aspirin during the break. So let me ask you a Nechemta kind of question. So first of all, where does Peter Beinart find hope in all this mess of a world? And where do we find hope? It's almost Hanukkah, which is about lighting lights in the darkness. Where do you find hope in all of this, in America, in Israel, and in the world?
Wow, that's a good question. I like the fact that you didn't say optimism, you said hope, because I think it's very important to distinguish the two things. That there have been, I don't think the Jewish tradition expects us to be optimistic, but having hope is something different, right? It's something that's different than a rational calculation of what things.
You know the definition of Jewish optimism is it couldn't get worse. You know?
Right.
That's a Jewish optimist. You know.
Well, look at the Hanukkah story, right? Or look at the Hanukkah story from a different perspective, right? We're told that the Syrian Greeks wouldn't let us practice Judaism, and so the Maccabee family rose up against them, and they restored Jewish sovereignty, and they rededicated the temple. And they and because they did all this stuff, great stuff with oil, we now have an excuse to eat latkes and donuts, right? So that's a nice story. That's an uplifting story. Now, what we're not told is that the Maccabees became the Hasmonean dynasty, who massively abused power and squandered this extraordinary thing they had created, which was the Jewish state, and we didn't get it for another 2,000 years. So that's not as optimistic. But after 2,000 years after squandering the Jewish state, Jews, after being scattered through the far corners of the world and subject to massacres and extermination attempts that made the stuff that the people in the Torah and the Talmud wrote about look like child's play, Jews created another Palestinian state, right? After having to wait for 2,000 years, right? So to me, that's a story of extraordinary, extraordinary hope if you have faith, right? What allowed the Jews to survive for 2,000 years and be alive and ultimately create the Zionist movement was faith, was belief that against all odds and all realities, that history would take a different turn. And so that's the way I like to think about it as well. I think that there are extraordinary young people in our community coming out of places like this who are willing to challenge our community's leaders based on what they think is right, based on a kind of moral vision, a moral passion of the same kind that animated Louis Brandeis and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, even though it's uncomfortable for them, even though people get very, very angry at them, even though people don't like some of the questions that they ask. And they're not just doing it because they care about the rights of Palestinians. Even more, in my experience, than that, they're doing it because they care about the honor of the Jewish people. And they believe that the honor of our people is implicated in the question of whether we, after all that we went through, can remember and not do to others what was done to us. Whether there is, one of the greatest, one of the midrashes I like the most is by a rabbi who asked the question, why did the Jews need to go to Egypt? After all, if you think about it, in the book of Genesis, Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob are already in the land of Israel. They're already there. You get them there by, within the first, very early on in Bereshit and Genesis. Why do they have to go all the way over to Egypt and be slaves for hundreds of years so they can wander back through and have all these problems in the book of, Numbers, and then finally at the end of the book, and then in Navi get to the promised land? And so the answer is that God didn't want the Jews to establish sovereignty, to control, have dominion over another people until we have tasted the bitter fruit of what it meant to be powerless. Didn't want us to wield power until we knew what powerlessness was like. And that's why it says 36 times in the Torah that we know the heart of the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. When I see young American Jews, and there are a lot of them, who are willing to put themselves on the line for that vision of Judaism to show our community that we haven't forgotten, for me, that's a source of tremendous inspiration.
Thank you, Peter Beinart. Please come and join us this weekend to hear Rabbi Avram Weiss, Rabbi Avi Weiss, and come back in January to continue our learning together. Have a lovely evening. Happy Hanukkah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Just wonderful. Thank you.